Okay.
We are the stage is officially listening.
That's right.
Yes.
All right.
It's good to see you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. There was a little bit of interference there, but right now it's good. So it's good to see you, Guy. It's been too long to connect, and I want to officially congratulate you on your new edition. And
thank you.
That's got to be a pretty exciting thing to bring another life into the world. I know it's happened
Orion
3 times. Yeah, beautiful.
Right. So, yeah, 3 times, totally.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm not in the place I'm normally at because my mother came to visit for the first time, so she's meeting Teague, and it's so Guy got kicked out, so he's at the park.
Well, that's what happens when new ones come along. The old ones get shuffled out.
Absolutely right. We see the priority here.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
So one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, right, and I think a lot of this has to do with the way that I see you really linking a lot of things together, right? And I want to set some frames up here, and then we can just see how it weaves all together. But it's precisely your work and the way you situate that sense of the primate, right? That goes then into justification, right? And that my understanding is this primate level is the level of like attachment, right?
Totally. 100%.
Right?
Yep.
Of attunement, attachment, and there's of course stuff with Bowlby and couples therapy. I mean, there's the evidence for that is just astronomical. It's so predictive how that goes, right?
It's very powerful force. Exactly.
It's surprising anyone ever missed that. Right? But we somehow missed that.
Right. I'm glad Bowlby picked it up and others. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And how that goes into justification, right? And in the social arena where you become in the way you talk about become a person, in some sense you become initiated as a person in terms of socially justifying your own existence in front of others. Right?
Exactly.
And also there's another way that you talk about it, just to set this frame too, which I appreciate, is that of course it's in that justification where things get really fucked up, right? And we end up totally split. So in order to justify my existence, I can't talk about this part of my existence, and then I feel guilty. Then we have these splits. Then we see the psychologist, and the psychologist is all about helping unite these lower systems and these orders and sharing the story, right?
Totally.
Such that you can open around these defensiveness and adaptations, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And all of that coming together and how and in what way that in some sense is connected ontologically to things, right?
Right. Absolutely.
And so as we were talking about, I'm just going to summarize what we talked about before we hit record, right?
Okay.
Which, one of the things for a while that I've been really thinking a lot about is this notion of skole, the Greek sense of skole, which usually translates into English as leisure. And of course, leisure and idleness. Leisure is the core. It's it's so core to economics, right? And metaphorically to everything that if everything's going well, people work and then they have leisure, right? If they work too much and they don't have leisure, that's bad, right?
Exactly.
And however, it's very different. That sense of leisure doesn't get at the deeper sense of the way that they talked about skole philosophically and religiously, right? The Greeks saw skole. Use this example. For example, Aristotle said that all theoria in geometry happens in skole. And then in the Apology, I think it was Socrates said that I actually think you guys shouldn't kill me. I think Athens should pay me to be in skole and and have and speak philosophy, have philosophical conversations, right?
Right.
And so you get this sense with skole that, like, for the Greeks, whereas in leisure, there's a sense in which there's time, and then you fill time. Yep. And then if you work hard enough and right enough, and the economy works well, then you can work for a certain amount of time, and then at the end you have free time or leisure. And you notice that conception of time is the same throughout. It's just a matter of if it's filled with stuff or not filled with stuff.
Yes.
But with something like theoria or philosophy or geometry, right, at these higher levels of essentially contemplating being, there's a very, very different sense of time, right? It's really precisely the pinnacle where means and ends come together as one thing.
Love it.
Right? And so bringing this back into me having a kid, right? And everything that we're talking about with attachment, right?
Right. Totally.
Is for the Greeks, skole, the root of skole means holding, to hold, right? Yep. This and that really only makes sense in relationship to time. So skole in the Greek sense was that time was something for which was of our concern. It was a central concern, in the sense that there was a way that if there's a way to hold time, such that time in turn turns back and holds us.
Love that.
Right? The skole was a way of being in time and holding time, but then of revealing time, right? In a way that they're mutually disclosive, right? And so that was the essence of time itself. So there's this really sense where meaning in time, right? Being in time would receive their pinnacle. And it wasn't like you were in skole and then not in skole. No, it was more, this was connected with the revelation of what time was, right? Which was a direct concern for us. And so if you look at it now, though, without that sense of time, where time now is more this kind of anatomical force in which, of course, we're subject to it and it concerns us, but there's no sense in which time at all responds to us, right? Yes. It's like we're subject to it. And therefore, I think what that's done on some level is we no longer see meaning and time as unified. Right? Or as coupled. So therefore time is just this force, right? That can't really hold meaning. It can just give lawful lawful, like, sustaining and entropy to circumstance. Therefore we need to find meaning in the sensations of our circumstances, if you will, right? Thus the drama. Yes. But there's nothing about time that it all responds to us, right? And that sense that the Greeks had about it. And so and just this idea that in skole, that it's this relationship to the ontology of time, that the way I am is already a comporting or a holding of time, and that time is that which is holding me. Right. And now I think about that. Now I have a baby, right? No, I'm thinking about all this, and now I have a baby. Right. And and somebody asked me how Teague was. And before I responded, I noticed that I had this picture of Teague, right? And that I hadn't noticed that there is no Teague. There's simply Teague being held. Right. Fascinating. In every picture, like either literally by our hands or being held by our attention or being held by the thing we set up or the crib. In fact, if there's like a second where we don't have our eye on him, it's like a big deal, right? Hey. And so, right? Totally. And so there's no such thing as Teague. There's Teague continuous with being held. Right. And then if we think about that, right? So there's something real. I'm like, okay, what is this connection between time, meaning, ontology, our vulnerability as human beings, the fact that we primordially start like this, like a deep vulnerability and an openness to the very holding, right? Which then that holding in turn, hopefully they internalize. And as they internalize it, as he grows up, we will then let go and he will take on the whole holding. And so in some sense, I'm wondering about this idea of holding. what does that reveal about ontologically the case
Beautiful.
with us and human beings, right?
Totally. All right.
So those are all the thought islands.
Those are the thought islands. Well, let's see if we can.
Right.
Let's see if we can peer underneath the surface, pull some sort of synergy out of the relation. That's a beautiful set of observations. Let me just say that. Okay. I didn't know about the Greek word skole. Can you say okay? So didn't know about that word skole. But let me give you just some thoughts to start to ground us in relation to the holding environment that we can then cultivate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The first thing, couple things that come to mind. One is our vertical integration. Okay. Vertical integration of us as organisms first. Okay. Into animals, which then is the base of our feeling system. And we can feel that, in our gut, in our loins and in our gut. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the way, the position of the body, and whether we got pain or emptiness in our stomach or horny and longs in the loins. It's the appetite of desire. It's a very Platonic Plato version. And that's our animal, our organism into animal level from a TOK view. So you're a biophysiological entity. And then the first thing is, hey, you got to take care of survival shit, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then we're social primates. Okay. So then we move into what I metaphorically refer to the heart. Okay. And the heart's the relationship attachment system. Okay. And there's nothing more central to an infant than this. I mean, because the entire safety, food, and relational matrix are all intimately intertwined in virtually every infant's experience. Okay. You see that in the holding, that whether they're being precared and connected, they're so dependent. And for the first 6 months, they are completely dependent upon the environment in which they're held. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I know they're absorbing stuff. They have enormous plasticity. They're upgrading the various models, but they're just checking shit out. Basically, they have a little bit of hand movement and a lot of they put shit in their mouth, right? Yes. And they track everything really fast with the head. So it's a visual auditory learning system, but the body is doing, it barely roll over.
Right. Yes. Right.
So the system then what they're doing from we spoke about John Bowlby. Okay. So what he noticed is the early systems of psychology were, well, the key really is food. So, we had orphanage, we just fed them. As long as they stayed alive and the temperature was thing and they didn't have any threat and they were getting fed, they should be all right. And then all of these kids in orphanages that were all broken in some ways, they were underdeveloped. They felt the whole socio-emotional systems was out of touch. They got these weird attachment structures that was a fundamental set of insecurity, that the environment would drop out of them at a particular level. That they weren't known and valued and they wouldn't be protected. And then kids would respond in certain ways. You'd either get very hyper dependent. Oh my God, just sending out alarms all the time, hyper neurotic, sending out certain alarms so that they try to get what little attention they could. Or they would go avoidant, which is hyper independent. They try to crush this need of the heart and then I don't need anybody. I'll just try to suppress it. Or they would get really, especially if they were abused, then they get really erratic and disorganized attachments. Okay. Yeah. And really, this is what later attachment is about, the circle of security that you're actually wanting to see build, which is a fundamental participatory dance between the caregiver and the infant, where you're tracking eye movements and building a shared attention intention space so that you can then create the ground, the socio-emotional ground that you will be cared for. And if you have particular needs, you can signal them and I'll be able to empathize with you and I'll meet them. Okay. Yeah. And then this creates the ground of the secure base from which the infant can then go at 6 months into the next couple of years and start to move away from the base. Okay. And then return to the holding environment if the kid falls and scrapes his knee, runs back to mom or dad and gets immediately returned to the holding environment. Because the entire primate animal organism system is like, check, okay, am I held safe or am I in the dark woods somewhere by myself? The ultimate panic, right? Which is then a complete
Yeah.
Which is, you're about ready to get eaten by a dark animal, a tiger in the woods. It's unbelievable.
Absolutely.
So that's an unbelievable, that darkness is unbelievably, concerning the core panic abandonment and the felt sense of worthlessness and this felt sense of insecurity, and then you get polyvagal defensiveness throughout the system when you're getting this structure.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're either being held in the matrix of care or not.
Yeah.
And those are the two basic secure, insecure. And of course, there's a lot in between. But basically, that the matrix says there's actually these two equilibrium states at a bimodal kind of distribution of being held. And then you track the interpersonal world. And indeed, we know kids can feel pretty safe with mom and not with dad, or vice versa, depending on the dance, the relation. It's called the circle of security in the more advanced formulations that then afford when it's there, it's a particular holding environment. So the when you have that, you're then going to create coherent integration in the environment, into the body, into the animal, into the social primate. Okay. And that's really the first couple of years is trying to create that fundamental secure base so the system can then basic trust to use, the world, and that you're going to get your needs met, or basic mistrust. This is the Ericksonian formulation. Okay. A basic trust versus mistrust that then says, hey, yes,
Makes
I will get my needs met because the environment will hold me in a particular way.
And the environment holds me because it sees me as valuable.
Yes, exactly.
That connection between value and holding, right? And what that means seems to be
super crucial,
deeply central. Yeah.
And I make a very important point about my own development in this theoretical structure called the influence matrix, which first emphasized it from an evolutionary instrumental way, which is totally valid, but it's incomplete originally. And that is what I called it, the social influence line. Okay. And it was defined in sort of instrumental terms. To what extent can you influence others in accordance with your interests? Okay.
Yeah.
So if I cry, will you come help me? Or will you ignore me? So it's an instrumental framing, which at a pragmatic level of survival is key. However, what I saw in the clinic room is that a lot of people could have influence, but feel very empty inside. Okay. And why? Because they weren't really valued. Okay. And they would go around and they would feel that they were not valued. And I realized that actually the ultimate sort of core, even from an evolutionary perspective, the core equilibrium safe space is to be valued, not just to be able to manipulate others instrumentally. Because if the contingency of manipulation disappears, then there's no intrinsic motive for mom and dad to love you. Then they're out of there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if if their motivational system is attached to you by its own valuing structure, then that at a particular level, that's really key. The other thing that's going to get back into why this is so important is because modern science basically thinks, and economics thinks in terms of instrumental means end relationship and trying to maximize productive control. Okay. They then, in fact, the entire social capital labor is basically influence and investment and return on investment and instrumentality, modes of production and control. Okay. So the whole thing basically is like, how do we efficiently maximize our influence and power over the things for the least amount of money in relationship to particular outcomes? So now you create the doing instrumental mindset that then fundamentally merges as the dominant mode. And this now brings in Erich Fromm, the dominant mode of doing that then becomes so salient for the way in which we all think. That's a quantifiable and many sciences, the behavioral and evolutionary sciences, we're all just selfish anyway, and this is what we really care about, and blah, blah, blah. And, what you can do is there isn't really any God, there's no real purpose, but you can at least get the most toys that you have and get as much accomplishment. And then that's the doing of what, so you get rich and you get status and you get leisure time, and that's what you're trying to get.
Yeah.
Do.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
And
so it won't love you, but at least we can hack it.
Yeah, at least we can hack it. At least I can get the most
it
toys.
Doesn't have nipples, but at least we can hack
that's
that.
Right. I got a big fucking Vita that's gonna substitute, for true love. But at least I got a big fucking Vita, or I have a nice Lamborghini or something, or not. And then you're on the low shit end and you can't do, and then you fail and all of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, what am I doing here? Well, I'm just trying to, everything's a means to an end relation. I mean, look at money. I mean, to the extent that then money becomes then the symbol, it's the ultimate instrumental symbol. Yet for some people, they get so confused. They're just like, I want to make more money.
Yeah.
You know, it's like as if that is some sort of quantifying that's empty calories at the core soul level, I would argue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that we have driven the doing mode to try to control energy and time in an instrumental kind of way to enormous excess. Okay.
Yeah.
And I see, and then that's not good calories for spending time in an attached relational environment in nature, feeling the oneness of the self-world modeling structure, feeling held by that, feeling fundamentally present and fulfilled in relationship to it, feeling the integration between the body into the animal, into the heart, into the justification, into the spirit, mattering, value, purpose. That's what I call vertical integration. Okay.
Yeah.
And you get vertical integration. I would say then for me, the label's wisdom energy. And what you feel is just a massive presence, a fundamental fit between the self-world environment and a massive presencing of that.
Yeah.
And then that is a eudaimonic ultimate endpoint. You are then in sync, in coherent integrative sync with the system. And then finally, to bring it back to kind of the leisure, at least I feel like I got lucky with Socrates. I'm a public intellectual. I get paid. I tell people at the level of leisure, it's like people are like, well, how much you work? I was like, well, I work either 5 or 75 hours a week, depending on how you calculate it. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Because, I have 5 hours of shit I need to do. That is the kind of labor. And, here's a paperwork thing, sign this, prep this. It's like, while I'm doing it, the only thing I'm doing is for instrumental purpose to get something done. So I check the fucking box. Yeah. But I'm super lucky that I'm now at a place as full professor, blah, blah, blah. That's like a huge amount of work. Like this. Is this work? I love this. I feel enormously just, present. I feel connected to you. I feel our souls connect in a particular way, and then we engage in dialogos. And then then my experience of being in the world is just enriched by these things. So it's like, it's productive and in growth promoting, but it doesn't feel like I'm trying to control something to get to some place. I'm in the place of being itself.
Yeah. And there's somehow in some sense implicit in there. And a couple of things that kind of link all of that together all the way down to that. With the first 6 months, because the second 6 months, right, to all the way as like mature professor, right? One is it sounds like your relationship with time is very, very different, right?
Totally.
In some sense, that there's a way that you relate to time that seems like these things, these meetings, or something like the pinnacle, or express this fundamental relationship where it's non-instrumental, but there is a sense in which it holds you and it inspires you. There's time disappears, there's the flow state, dialogos, all of that.
Totally.
Now it's interesting too that this sense about when you talked about after the first 6 months, and then the child starts to venture away from the holding, and then they come back, right? It's such a cool image of that because you can see that too, because they venture out, they're like,
they'll check back and then they're going to see what they're going to do,
right? And then they'll check back really quick. Are you still there? Right? Like as long as you're still there, I'll go out, and then you look back, right? They intrinsically are testing something.
That's right.
And God, and there's so many different ways that could get fucked up, right? Like, because I was thinking about that when what happens when the child comes back and then the mother's destroyed and angry because the child left her, right?
Totally.
Like, and then and so there's all kinds of ways that dynamic relation can get all whacked out, right? And that usually and expresses itself in all these, in broken marriages and
we test it all the time for good reason. You're like, hey, I'll drop a cry over here, or I won't do other things. And of course not with conscious justification, but the design of the system is to know where it is. And we do this with our spouses. You test them. You drop little, not like very rarely, I'm going to adjust my wife. Some people but you do it intuitively because you want to see where the value and attention is. Okay. Yeah. Like, my kids, they're 5 and 3, and you cut 2 pieces of cake. Hey, his cake's bigger than mine. It's like,
yeah.
And I was like, okay, but they're going to check that, and they're going to be like, hey, you cut it, and that reflects something in your heart, doesn't it? You love him more than you love me, or you better draw attention to that. There's
totally,
that's a chronic state of, is this environment really holding? And then I test it and see what happens.
Totally, totally. Like well, the other thing about that I think I saw as you're talking about this differently than I saw it before, which is this back and forth, right, relation, that it's really, how dynamic it is. It's like, I know we talk about it in terms of like, okay, is the child starts to objectify, right? Will that object hold me, right? Is that all? But really, when we look at it, that they're not actually checking to a thing, but that the stability is precisely a way of a modal of relations happen, right? So it's not like there's something stable in a thing-like way. It's a dynamic, a nexus of relations that are going on.
Totally.
In which they start to feel a certain kind of safety with. And of course, the world is a chaotic network of relations, right? That they're trying to tolerate and then go back and forth.
Right.
And that's actually, and that it's also, it seems to me, this relationship, in some sense, that back and forth implies a certain temporality, right?
Yep.
In some way, this, all right, is my past. If I turn around and I look back, will it still be there?
Well,
this future, right? There's something drawing me in that I don't know about yet. Therefore, it's chaotic. But then I'll turn around to this past, and this back and forth movement seems. I would imagine
there are multiple.
Probably one of the. There's something there about temporality.
Right. Well, the system starts to be able to extend itself over time. That's one of the first things. Okay. So then the way in which at first it's pretty immediate, and then the capacity to then, and indeed it is the argument that John and I and Chris were making in the Elusive Eye, was it is this capacity to begin to extend the self over time through multiplicity of possible simulations, where the environment then changes but then it is the extension of self in that time that really starts to give this self agent environment relation, and then the self then relational matrix that then creates the model of the self. Okay, so then we start to carry, and then we extend. So that issue of who am I across time basically becomes the modeling structures that afford you the opportunity to get a grip, on the world.
Right.
And so how you build that is through the attachments of, first, mom and dad need to be present, or there needs to be a security system present the first 6 months. Then all of a sudden that then begins to extend into an autonomy versus shame and doubt. That's the next at least title, which is autonomy, is like, hey, I can now actually start to exhibit. I have the motoric and cognitive capacity to start to exhibit control over the world and distance myself. Okay.
Yeah.
But as soon as I get distance in any way out here in the darkness, and I'm still just learning shit, it all of a sudden becomes a dark, scary world. And I have to quickly touch, is mom going to be there? If I move away, when I look back. And so then you have to expand the temporality of the field of consideration, because now the opportunity across time is increasing, and you have to start to really protect what's going on in relationship to that.
Right. It's so interesting just to kind of grok this sense of, if I turn around and if I look up and it gets scary and I turn around, are they still there? That there is so linked to value, right? Am I valued enough such that people stay around, right? It's so interesting to think about it like that, right? Being valued is so primary.
Totally. That's it.
Primary.
That is this core of the heart soul, is to be known and valued by important others, at least according to unified theory. It's the fundamental calories, of that part of your psyche. And it's absolutely as crucial as good calories for the body. It's a fundamental, in some ways, even, at the level. So am I known and valued? Yeah. It's not just can I manipulate them, but fundamentally they care about me. And my essence, and in non-contingent ways they care about me. And that's what people really track, and they desperately need. And unfortunately, because of our humanness, though, we get to a stage where there's an access to the interior through justification, which then you start talking, Okay.
Yeah.
And little kids don't have to deal with this as much, but as you start to get older, you can then, the cognitive capacities of justification start to say, well, okay, I know mom wants to hear shit from me, or dad wants to hear shit, or my friends want to hear shit, and they can ask me questions. So then I find myself basically generating a persona, public justification out here. Okay.
Yeah.
And that creates then the opportunity for imposter syndromes, which then emerge in middle to older childhood, where you actually start to then create a public face, the persona, as Jung called it, the mask, okay, that you then wear in relation. And you realize you do that for social influence purposes, meaning because you wear the mask, you avoid their judgment in a particular way, or you obtain their praise. But at the same time, it creates a fundamental social versus core self split, because it's like this, they love me now as a function of the contingencies that I give them. But if they really knew me, I'm terrified they wouldn't. I see that all the time in relationship to once adolescents start to struggle with mental health, and it creates this very, very, brutal dichotomy. And there's no holding environment there that can be really generated that's fundamentally embodied, because you can't bring yourself to test. So you fake it, but you then don't trust that you would actually be held. I have many, many clients who had to work through that process to afford coherent integration along those lines.
In fact, it's interesting because I work with people one-on-one too, and in so many cases, like I just started to. It's at the point where I could just kind of almost look for it. Right, there's something like life was fine, right? Everything was fluid. I was loved, and then we moved, and then it was a new school. And then I had to and then there's the socialization, right? The break with something, some kind of security. And then they're in a new social matrix. And then there's all these breakdowns. And on some level, right, that's so much of their personality has been defined in that adaptation, right?
Totally.
Which has all these dichotomies in it, right? And that's usually what we end up talking about, right? Are issues around that fundamental break. Yeah.
Totally. Exactly. And then that activates the insecurity of not being held in the environment. And then people struggle with various strategies, testing, defenses, coping strategies, etc. And, if they are constrained and limited, and they also lead to additional problems, you get an entrenched maladaptive problem of a social phobia, a fundamental sense of insecurity, an inability to articulate what's going on, a hyperreactivity, the vulnerability, because you're always on edge. And then, of course, that makes you very difficult to then engender, the risks that are necessary. And they perceive them often as great risks to then go out and try to find a new secure identification matrix. Identification matrix is a self-world identity process of this is the elements of the world. This is my map of that. Not necessarily conscious, but just intuitively the way you map it, my place in that world. And this is what's going to happen to me if I behave in X, Y, and Z ways.
Right. The sense about, right, one of the things that's interesting to me about this is this, you can see through all of this that, I often talk about it like this. It's like, I don't know about all the biology, but in terms of mammals, I don't think there's anything more helpless than the human infant, is there?
Not even close.
Not even close. And what's interesting about this has always struck me, is like, we all start off like that. Like the way we start is completely dependent, completely helpless in every dimension that you can imagine.
Totally.
And who's going to Mars, right? Who's on top of the food chain? Who's the one, as far as we can tell, I mean, who knows ultimately, but as far as we can tell, who's the one that caught a sight of its own existence and then can relate back with that existence, right? Even that you can feel a kind of vulnerability or transparency or a porousness going on. And I think about this, and this is where it starts to get kind of ontologically, where I want to bring this in, and I'm just curious how this weaves together. so there's a deep vulnerability that seems to afford the highest levels of theoria, right? Of mystical realization, of right, deep conceptualization, right? These unitary things and abstractions and all of that, right? And in one sense, there's this helplessness that also, right, and in this relationship with that vulnerability in its holding, right?
Yes.
And it's all so if you think about this statement, I think is Jesus, I think it's I think he says this in the Bible. I'm so not up on that stuff, but where he says the meek shall inherit the earth. You think about that statement, right? Such a weird thing at face value. The meek shall inherit the earth. When you think about it like that, right? Like in the terms we're talking about, you can start to get where he's talking about. Like that there is a way that, and I think what he's basically saying is the meek, when loved, right? That can potentiate this vulnerability into something very, very powerful, right? And so there's that part of it that's just, it seems, I'm wondering, it's like there's something ontologically about vulnerability, right? And holding, right? That is expressed here. And then also, but it also strikes me that, you know, as human, sorry about that.
That's fine.
I've got to figure out a way so when it calls, it doesn't blink out. You know, it's like, yeah, so that something about the essence of being human, right, is really, really tied with being vulnerable. But like, I don't know anybody. In fact, I've been teaching courses for years, and I've never had anyone say, not once have I ever had anybody respond to me when I've said, well, hey, you know, maybe this is a good time to be vulnerable, where they're like, someone had to say it, right? Thank God. Right? No, it's always this sense of like, all right. That on one level, our humanity seems to be very much about this deep vulnerability, right? But there's a level at which it can be, we can also be exposed, right? Which is, I think, what we're really afraid of when we talk about being afraid of being vulnerable. What we're really, really afraid of is we collapse that with the involuntary sense of being subject to something in which I'm exposed to, which I think is really, really different. Vulnerability seems to, at least in my mind, has more of a sense of I'm volunteering, right? There's some sense of I'm willing, right, to be vulnerable, both will, the positive sense, and willing, right, and the generative sense. But when that holding environment, right, breaks down, and we develop defenses, and so I don't want to be human. So what I do is I put a shell around myself. But here's the paradox: is like the moment I put a shell around myself, and this is why our psychological defenses on one level work, but the cost to them are great. I think it has to do with this, is because the moment I put a shell around myself is the moment I become brittle. Right. So and it seems to me that this relationship to because on some level you could say the mystic realizing on the top of the mountain, realizing being, right? You could almost see that is in some sense a profound relationship with his own vulnerability, such that he's so vulnerable that he's vulnerable to the deepest depths of himself and transparent to it, such that he realizes the ultimate depth of oneness, and paradoxically, in that full realization of vulnerability, he's invulnerable, right? Because he's everything, right? We think about that as a symbol. And this kind of this ontological sense, this verticality, right, that has to do with holding time, vulnerability, bringing those things together. What what stands out for you in that?
Well, a couple of things. So yes, I think you're first off, we should highlight the vulnerability aspect of our nature. Okay, that we're born into the world vulnerable. All right. And then that affords us a wonderful set of both opportunities and serious risks at multiple levels. And then our potentialities are structured around trying to mitigate and navigate those risks. Okay. And potentially can be realized through a huge amount of affordance. Okay, so let's just talk this through. So I think the bottom line, why are we so vulnerable from an evolutionary perspective? I think the fundamental answer is because we're incredibly plastic. Okay, I was just listening to Heather Hiring on Jim Rutt, and she was like, from hunter-gatherer perspective, we're sort of the niche generalizers, meaning that we can bounce from, one of the things about us, we can bounce from niche to niche. Okay. And learn learn strategies in a wide variety of niches. I mean, that's what our cognitive language, collective intelligence capacities, our creative capacities afford us that. How the hell do you though get all the cognitive gadgets and the availability to do that? Well, super long time of development. You know, and the other thing that probably the mechanics of the size of the head then that requires to hold the brain, and then the birthing process is like, well, you can't stay in there forever. We already have serious problems at birth. It's a hell of a process.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you got to get the thing out of there really, before it's ready, basically. And now all of a sudden you have this really neoteny is the extended period of neonatal development. And Stephen Jay Gould points out that this is a really almost certainly a central feature of our development. So a whole bunch. So nature basically says, all right, if we're going to get systems that can have this unbelievable cognitive learning flexibility, that they can learn repertoires and then repertoire off of that, so that most animals just learn repertoires. We learn repertoires on top of our repertoires. They put them all together in evolutionary new ways through our learning. And then now we justify on top of that. So we are really our behavioral flexibility is really in a class by itself. Okay. To get there, the system has to be able to download and manipulate all that. So then it comes out very, very vulnerable. So now let's think about what that means about our condition. If I am fed and held well, okay, I can then grow and network into a collective intelligence that has an enormous amount of power and be a part of something belonging. Actually, my doctoral student is probably going to do a dissertation on suicide called The Ontology of Belonging and Suicidal Behavior in Adolescents. Okay. And basically, it's the ecology and ontology of belonging, in her estimation, that affords the coherent integration. And what gets deviated for so many people is the breakdown in that, and then an internalized critical looping that then alienates and leads to psychache, and then a crash and burn of alienation. And you can see then you have all of this potential. First off, you might get neglected and abused. That's horrifying, right? Or you might get situated so that you're in a contingency where you have to fake it, but then you feel empty inside. That's another sort of developmental line, an aberrant or atypical or less than fulfilling developmental line. And then there's this enormous potential to grow in connection with each other in nature in a fulfilled way because of the enormous plasticity and learning potential of the structure of the system. So our developmental trajectories are enormously variable, you know. And so the idea that we're sort of like trying to track, oh God, is this a bad sign? Is this a good sign? Where are we? And have potentials that afford that. The other thing that I was thinking of when you were talking, I hooked up with a theorist a while ago who really centered on this core split of our potential. He actually called his framework called the one divide. Okay. And he basically argued that birth and early events inevitably result in trauma. Okay. And then you have the activation of the low relational value, low social influence, panic of abandonment, death, desertion. Okay. And that core panic is something that you are really programmed to like avoid. It's like, oh my God, am I going to be seen and devalued and dejected and removed? Okay. So then what happens then is the self system begins to model what makes me vulnerable. And then how do I create a defensive self-structure that's trying to compensate and avoid and control in an instrumental way the avoidance of the discovery of that abandonment. And he argues that many, many people, and I think this is true, many, many people then live their lives essentially on the cusp. This is really a felt sense of insecurity. Is you're building a defended character armor structure. Wright talks about character armor from a psychodynamic perspective. You build this up, and the function of that is to avoid the terror, with the fear that if you fail to do this, you would be revealed and you'd be rejected, and you have a fundamental abandonment. Okay. The structure of that, if you think the vertical integration structure of that, it's an empty, dark core that is speaking to you constantly. And the rest of your character structure then is a compensation to try to avoid falling into something. Okay. Well, think about that. It's like, exactly. It's like, and that is, and now I need to work really hard to build stuff. And then the felt sense of existence is, how far can I stay away from it? But everything then you're doing is actually negatively reinforcing. And what that means is you do shit so that you avoid the potential horror of consequence. And it takes a little bit of the edge off periodically, but then you have to keep doing stuff to keep the abyss falling away. I've met a lot of people that live their lives like that. And it's pretty tragic, because the entire structure of being then is like, it's just, how do I avoid falling into abyss, as opposed to how do I live in the divine bliss? Okay.
And the fullness, not the negation.
Exactly. It's like, oh my God, you mean to say that I can be valued and value that into my animal body, into my soul and my cells, and feel at oneness, with the sense of divine, with the ultimate purpose, with the negentropic, complex, coordinated, integrated processes. That's my spirit into my system of justification. Then you drop into that and you just feel a perspectival heart, flood with a sense of appreciation, gratitude, love, awe, all of that, and then down into the body. And that's the true self, what he calls the true self integration. And for me, it's basically the stack of an affirming belief system and spirit that has some sense making, that makes sense of the heart, that's known and valued, that's into the body, that's felt held and secure in the environment itself. And then I think one of the things that we should be really emphasizing, my friend Rob Scott emphasizes this, calls it the fundamental shift, is those moments, of being itself, are the awe-inspiring glory of being itself. and to be just in the moment of awareness, of fundamental awareness, and to cultivate the taste of that beauty of awareness itself. I mean, I find that to be, and then you get back to the whole leisure place, is sort of like to have the opportunity to simply be, right? And then to be, and to have that beingness be, so fill your existence in the world. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. And I think there's an opportunity for us to achieve that. He certainly makes this case. I believe this too, that we socialize towards instrumental control and doing, and can I do more and do more and do more and get more and consume more and blah, 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 the whole, and then you can rest or watch your damn, whatever is fun for you. And it's like, you're missing the entire point of being and becoming modes of, we should be working when certainly you have to at some level. It's not like you don't do, but the cultivation of that fundamental being in the world and being held by the world in a moment of the infinite now, in a particular kind of presence, to be able to taste that, to be present with that. I think that's I've certainly grown in the last 5 years in that mode. And, even as a clinical psychologist, we aren't socialized too much to orient to that. I think that's a great, many wisdom traditions do orient that way. And I've really felt fortunate that I've been hanging out with people over the last 5 years that really shine the light on that in a rich way.
Right. Well, one of the things that is you've been describing all of this, it's just been, it's a marvel to realize our pre-reflective organismic sense knows this relationship with folding. It's embodied, embedded, right? So, there's a deep, seems super intelligent to me. It's its network of is intelligibility that seems to somehow be oriented to this, right?
Totally.
So just this idea of that, because I've seen this over and over again, where, you know, like it's really true. It's like, I think it's set up in such a way, and this has a lot to do with nihilism. This has a lot to do with the meeting crisis, all of this, right? Where we don't even consider that we don't have an understanding of being that isn't contingent, right?
Yep.
Not this sense
Beautifully
of
said.
contingency, the sense of that there are principles, right, that in some sense govern the orderliness, or make it possible for orderliness. And in some sense, philosophy, right, philosophia in the deepest sense of the word, was really in some sense about getting close to and beholding those principles, right?
I agree.
That in some sense, the principle itself, you can't what's interesting about it is the principle itself is like, it's one of those things where you can't put into language.
Right.
Right.
I think, yes, it's the way, you go Taoism, catches this pretty early. I think when they say the Tao is not the Tao, it's a participatory perspectival presencing that is definitely at this animal heart, felt sense of being. And also I think it often is, when we have our transcendent states, it's trans-justificatory. So in virtually all mystic states, it's, the ego dies or dissipates the narrating, regulator, or seeking justification, control, and legitimacy, right? Mm-hmm. That is crucial, but it is a particular kind of mode that I think our modern style is like way overactivated in a particular way.
Oh, totally.
And then it kind of controls the shit, and it's trying to regulate and make sure everything fits in the damn boxes that it's trying to control, and it will get anxious or pissed off if it doesn't, win its justification in a particular way. And that's definitely not the coherent stacked integration. In fact, that's just one piece of it, and you need to be underneath it and above it, rather than just trying to use it as the primary, propositional reasoning network, which is really modernity. Basically said that in many ways. It was like, well, we're going to reason our way through justification and science into this. I know Ian McGilchrist makes a number of points in these directions, and I agree.
Yeah, right. And this sense of witnessing, and I'm sure you've probably experienced this being a therapist too, of that. In some sense, I would imagine therapy is a lot like this, but just when you start to get real about it, people start to have these insights that, and it's usually when their defensive strategies don't like actually start the balance, the benefit, right, of that goes down, right?
Right.
Because usually I've noticed this with like kind of psychological forms of defensiveness, it creates this immediate sense of safety, but in a way that numbs you or has you not see the long-term consequences. And I think that thing that you're talking about, this Nemo, this emptiness inside, in which if you fall into that, it's all over, right? That's the felt sense. Then you live such that you're not that. And then you articulate a whole way of being that's about an avoidance of that, right? But then you're dependent on that in some weird sense. So you go in with people and you start talking about this, and you're like, well, what would happen if you just didn't do that?
Yeah, totally.
Like, and this anxiety comes up, and then there's a way where it's like it takes something to be with the anxiety and the annihilation, because there's a deep mistake going on in there, right?
Exactly.
But when people can tolerate it, right, and the conditions are right, and they can tolerate it, and they can open to it, and go through that initial, it's like feeling, it's like that level of experience is so intense, right? It's like
totally.
It's like imagine it's like the feeling, it's like the most haunting, nauseating, like everything unattractive that you could imagine in your very pores is the recognition that that's all that there is. That's what it feels like, right?
That's
it's exactly like total awfulness, right? In the deep sense of the word. And it takes something to even get any leverage to be able to turn towards it, right?
Absolutely. It takes
when you do, there is something though, because, and I'm kind of getting this through this conversation, and in a different way that I don't know if I quite saw it like so congruently here is that we have our nervous system is really knows how to open to that deep openness, right? It's like something catches, like if you can feel through that barrier, right? And you can like, at some point you're like, all right, non-being, right?
Totally.
At some point you're like, well, there is a lot of room. It is kind of spacious in here. In fact, there's like an affording spaciousness, and like, but that your nervous system knows how to take in that in the most generative sense.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
If it's right, it has that potential. Okay. It also, the reason people get all tangled up is precisely because the way that egoic narrator frames it all. Okay. If you frame it in a particular way and you do have a core anxiety thing, and then you get a lot of reinforcement, that is in structure because the system basically is reading this as that this is annihilation itself. Okay. And then you build all the justification around that. And then if you do it in the right way and afford the person to bring to bear what that annihilation actually means, at first it's terrifying, right? But you're right. If the opening of what this might mean and what might be on the other side of it is afforded to the individual, and they can hold the egoic defenses off or participate in a flow that don't lead to the reciprocal narrating and the need to escape in safety, but actually get present and take the step off into sort of like what appears to be the abyss. And then it's like, and then you're like, you know, here I am not meeting up my dad's standards, and here I am not being this, and here I am being the person that's rejected, and here I am, and here I still am, and here I am like so many other people, and then here I am like living my life, and then it's just sort of like, and then here I am living, and then it's like, well, isn't this fascinating that this is all part of the drama, you know, that then and then all of a sudden the relationship to this, instead of the doer, controller, manipulator, avoider, defender, is just the beer, you know. It's just sort of like, and of course that is that shift when I see it.
Pretty soon you're like, you start noticing like, what is this am? The am doesn't seem to it keeps following me around everywhere. What is this am? Right there you go.
Totally. So it's like, hey,
there's the beginning of all of it. Yeah, of the whole new ride.
You start to make that fundamental shift, and then I think that, you know, to coach people into the mode of fulfillment. You know, what is fundamental fulfillment? And certainly from my vantage point, you know, it is in the now of existence, in that felt sense of beingness, being and becoming. The doing is crucial, but that's means to end shit. This fundamentally is the eudaimonic point, you know, that affords the particular capacity, whether it's by some design, or at least just a hell of a fortunate system towards neg entropy that affords us what it is like to be cohering and integrating across multiple levels, and then to have the reflective felt sense of appreciation for that, which to me took a little cultivation, but is now super available. You know, and it's when that's a nice place.
I remember when you talked about that. I think part of what you mean with that is when you talk about wisdom energy. So would you say wisdom energy, and is in the way you're talking about it, is that felt experience of all of that intelligibility coming through you could feel it in your body from the inside out, right?
Exactly.
In a way that
Yep. So it expanded my, you know, I had my framing or whatever, but that I did reach another layer, both above and below my justificatory narrative of expansion and coherent integration, and it afforded a presencing of that beingness. And then and basically it was, I am energy. I'm in this energy information blob. Okay. But it's actually the arrangement of my energy information blob then affords a profound experience of wisdom. And that's what I meant as wisdom energy. It's just sort of like, you know, it feels the way, you know, it's just, I'm walking my dog. There's an opportunity here for profound sustainability, meaning it's like, if I just relate to myself and the world, I don't need to of course I need to eat a few things, but I mean, it's like the consumption and the doing and all this other stuff, sort of like, God, it's like, I don't know that we really are well balanced in this regard. It's like, what the hell is this? Why don't I just I can just be in love, basically it's just being in love with existence. I described it as loving being without memory or desire, and in that the egoic facility sort of drops and out. And it is a profound sense of being held. I really do feel held by the universe, and at one with it in a particular way, in that self-other gist grip of the world.
And that at the level of feeling, I think that's what I think I'm like reflecting back with you about this to the earlier part of our conversation. Is it? It sounds like an embodied optimal grip. With being, right? Like
that's me and John as cognitive scientists will tend to describe it that way. Yes.
Yeah. In fact, I talked with John the other day about this, because he's been looking a lot more at attachment, and the way he described attachment, right, was as the result and demonstration of optimal gripping. Right, of this whole thing about that it does make sense, because we're not looking at objects, right? It's dynamical relations all the way down, right? We know something. I think in fact, I think the mistake is often we start to relate to ourselves as a thing, right? That can have stuff and right, but it's really a dynamical affordance of that. And would you say that you feel that resonance that you're talking about, that embodied resonance, it seems like your attachment systems, right, our system, do you feel that through the same, I don't know if you want to call it circuitry, that one feels deeply valued in a parent relationship? Is it a similar like circuitry? Yeah.
Well, I mean, so certainly at the relational level, yes. I mean, I was sort of expanding beyond in terms of the entire self, and I will, as a social mammal, I'll feel it in relation. Okay. But so in terms of my attachments, let's say with myself, okay. The attachment with yourself is the internalized introject. The introject is the ego builds its model of the self and then builds a second order justification system of, I, me relation, and then starts to hold the standard of self reflecting on the self, the intuitive heart level. And self-esteem then, and self-acceptance refers to the way the introject treats the heart. Okay. And that then often, it's not always the parent, the way you do it, but to the internalized other. And the normal standards are you've internalized the standards of society, the super ego. So you now know what contingent society is going to tell you that's loved and acceptable. And then you judge yourself accordingly. So you jam the shit that's not acceptable into the closet, and other people can't see it. And then you won't lose influence and value. But then of course you break the structure of coherent integration across the verticals, because you're now taking a core aspect of the self that thinks it's an organismic valuing process. It's like, hey, this is how I want to express myself. You're like, like my friend who was gay in 1985 is like, you can't be fucking gay, so because all the homophobia is like, you jam that shit in the closet, and and then you had to figure out how to come out of the